looking at some of the absolute most dangerous kings and tyrants in all of human history.
Section 1. Ivan IV, Russia's first Tsar.
So at first, Ivan was actually seen as a reformer. He was a strong leader trying to unify a pretty fractured Russia. But after the tragic death of his wife, his mind completely collapsed into this dark paranoia and uncontrollable rage. He started believing literally everyone was plotting against him. And because of this intense fear, he created the Oprichniki. These guys weren't just ordinary soldiers. They were a secret police force of executioners. They dressed entirely in black, they rode black horses, and their whole purpose was just to spread absolute terror across Russia. Entire cities were wiped off the map if he even suspected them of anything. Like one of the absolute worst massacres was in Novgorod, where thousands were slaughtered just because Ivan had a hunch they were betraying him.
And the tragedy of Ivan's unchecked rage? It didn't stop at the city borders. In a sudden, totally uncontrollable outburst of violence, Ivan struck and killed his own son. It's just horrific. He was a ruler so consumed by madness and so deeply feared that even his own flesh and blood wasn't safe from his absolute authority.
Let's move to Section 2 and see how this builds. Genghis Khan, the conqueror of empires. Shifting gears to the vast steppes of Asia, Genghis Khan built the largest contiguous empire in human history. But that massive expansion came at a truly horrifying cost, tens of millions. Historians estimate his campaigns might have resulted in the deaths of tens of millions of people. Think about that for a second. If an entire city dared to resist his army, that city wasn't just defeated, it was completely erased from the map. It's a scale of death that is honestly almost impossible to wrap your head around. But what made him so incredibly dangerous wasn't just his huge army, it was his strategy. He used psychological terror as a calculated weapon. If one city fell brutally, the next city would often surrender without even lifting a single sword, just from hearing his name. The message was blindingly simple, right? Resist and disappear from history, period. And his influence was so vast that even today, millions of people unknowingly carry his genetic legacy, firmly cementing him as one of the most feared and influential figures ever.
Section 3. Caligula, the Mad Emperor.
Now, much like Ivan the Terrible, Caligula's reign actually kicked off with a huge celebration. The Roman people were thrilled when he took power. But here's the catch. He became emperor at just 24 years old. Having absolute, completely unquestioned power over the greatest empire on earth at such a young age, well, it seemingly broke his reality. The descent into madness was incredibly swift and absolutely terrifying. Now, what's really interesting about this is the sheer absurdity of his terror. He straight up began declaring himself a living god. He'd wander around the palace having casual conversations with the moon, and famously ordered his heavily armed Roman soldiers to physically attack the ocean. But the real horror, that was his treatment of human beings. Executions literally became his entertainment. He forced political prisoners to fight wild animals or each other just for laughs. And as the ultimate insult to the Roman political system, he allegedly made his horse a senator. Some accounts say he even gave the animal a marble stall and a jeweled collar. Look, whether every single story is perfectly accurate or maybe slightly exaggerated by his enemies, the undisputed fact remains. Rome lived in absolute daily fear. Ultimately, the terror was so intense that even his own personal guards had to turn against him.
Section 4. Vlad III, the inspiration for Dracula.
Entering one of the darkest periods in European history, we have Vlad III of Wallachia. With Vlad, punishment wasn't about justice, or honestly even revenge. For him, punishment was a very public, very graphic message. His preferred method for delivering this message? Impalement. Enemies were placed on large wooden stakes and left to suffer publicly in agonizing ways. Historical accounts describe what can really only be called entire forests of impaled bodies, deliberately placed right outside city walls. Imagine approaching a city and seeing that. The sheer visual horror of this tactic was designed to completely break the psychology of any invading army or rebellious faction. But here's the twisted duality of his legacy. To his own people in Wallachia, Vlad was actually seen as a fierce protector. He punished corruption with extreme brutality, for sure, but in doing so, he drastically reduced crime inside his land. So history is kind of left remembering him as both a revered national hero to some and the ultimate nightmare ruler to others, a guy so terrifying that he became the literal inspiration for Dracula. Moving to Section 5, Joseph Stalin, the man who ruled through silence.
Bringing this right into the modern era, let's examine one of the most feared dictators of the 20th century. Stalin controlled the Soviet Union with an iron fist and absolute authority. But unlike those ancient conquerors, his ultimate weapon wasn't loud, bloody wars on the battlefield. It was a quiet, suffocating fear, institutionalized through the Gulag system. Millions of people were sent to these brutal labor camps. But the true terror of Stalin's regime, it was what it did to everyday society. The system deliberately broke down human trust. Neighbors started reporting on neighbors just to survive. Close friends would simply vanish overnight. Merely speaking the wrong sentence, or even just being suspected of thinking the wrong thought, could result in your entire life being erased.
So the crucial point is that this wasn't just your standard dictatorship. I mean, photographs were literally edited to remove political enemies who had fallen out of favor. History books were continuously rewritten. People didn't just die, they simply vanished from existence altogether. Stalin's terror was the organized erasure of reality itself. We've looked at Russia, the Mongol Empire, ancient Rome, Wallachia, and the Soviet Union. We've seen madness, military conquest, and psychological erasure. So, looking across this incredibly dark spectrum, what is the thread that actually connects all these rulers? Well, they existed in totally different eras. They commanded entirely different empires. They held vastly different religious and political beliefs. The context of how they rose to power couldn't possibly be more distinct from one another. But they all followed the exact same devastating pattern. Power without limits becomes fear without control. This is the core thesis of this explainer. History has proven to us time and time again across every single continent and every century that when one single person is handed too much power, humanity ultimately pays a terrible price.
These specific kings, emperors, and tyrants, they're long gone. Their empires have crumbled, and their reigns of terror are safely confined to the history books. But their stories remain with us today as vital, blinking red warnings. Because the real danger we face was never just about Ivan or Caligula or Stalin as isolated